Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Arnella and today's video is going to be a deep dive into the character relationships of Jane Austen's Emma. I'm really excited about this one, to be honest. I've even brought the whole teapot with me here today because I suspect we're going to be here for quite some time. So hold on to your hats, everyone. Emma was first published in 1815. It is very much a character-driven story. There is a plot, of course, but it's dependent on the actions of the protagonist as well as the interactions between the side characters. In other words, the relationships. So in order for this analysis to make sense, I will need to talk about the plot in detail. So if you haven't read it, this will be full of spoilers. It's unavoidable, sorry. So the first part of this video will be a quite detailed synopsis, and should you want to skip that for some reason, then you should skip ahead to here for the analysis part. So without further ado, let's start it off. Emma Woodhouse is a 21-year-old wealthy girl who lives with her father in the countryside village of Highbury. The book starts off with Emma's beloved governess recently being married to a local man called Mr Weston and therefore has to move away from Emma and her father. Despite feeling the loss of her beloved friend whom has lived with them since she was a little girl, Emma claims to have been the matchmaker of this newlywed couple and takes great pride in that. Now, Emma is a very clever and intelligent young woman, but she's also very arrogant when it comes to her own intelligence. And it doesn't take long before Emma decides that doing matchmaking for other people is an excellent idea. And the next person to receive her efforts in this regard is her friend Harriet Smith. The only one who really challenges her ideas on this subject is their family friend, Mr Knightley, and they have quite a few arguments on this subject. But Emma is far too stubborn to admit to being wrong and goes ahead with her plan anyway. So she starts to meddle in Harriet's love life, and this is where things start to go badly. She persuades her to refuse a proposal of marriage from a man called Mr Martin, whom Harriet is actually interested in, because Emma has her eyes set on somebody else for Harriet. And of course, Harriet does whatever Emma tells her to do because she is younger than her. She looks up to her as a kind of role model, and she's also quite the gullible character. Even though her heart may have been in the right place, Emma kind of manipulates Harriet into falling in love with this other man, Mr Elton. And everything seems to be going according to plan for Emma until Mr Elton shows his true feelings by proposing to Emma rather than Harriet. To which Emma is disgusted, basically. Not only is she not at all interested in Mr Elton, but she has actually decided not to get married at all. She sees herself as more of an intellectual rather than romantic person, and she could never see herself leaving her father behind in that big house all by himself. So yeah, Emma is shocked, Harriet is heartbroken, and Mr Elton flees to the party town of Bath to lick his wounds. Enter Mr Frank Churchill. This is a man who comes to Highbury to visit his father for a couple of weeks, and within a day or so he has managed to charm the entire village, including Emma, with the exception of Mr Knightley, who immediately finds him fishy. He is a good-looking, sociable and well-bred sort of gentleman, and it doesn't take long for Emma to start feeling smitten by him, as they socialize in the same circles and he even comes to their house to visit them. It is around this time that a proper mystery enters the story. An old acquaintance of Emma's named Jane Fairfax has just returned to Highbury to stay with her aunt and grandmother. Jane is a girl who was orphaned as a child and had no inheritance and is therefore of lower social standing, and she's been raised with friends of her family up until that point. So she comes to stay with her aunt and grandmother, who, despite their low income, is still good friends with the wealthier families of Highbury. The mystery is that a luxurious piano, or pianoforte, has been sent to Jane Fairfax at her grandmother's home from an anonymous sender. So the small town gossip is pretty much on fire at this point. Everyone has their own theory on who could have sent it. Who is Jane's secret admirer? Mrs. Weston, Emma's former governess, points out that Mr. Knightley has been giving Jane a lot of attention recently. But Emma is quick to dismiss this. And yet, rumours start to circulate whether Mr. Knightley could be Jane's new secret admirer, and Emma doesn't like this at all. In fact, Emma thoroughly dislikes Jane Fairfax. She thinks she's cold and reserved and doesn't enjoy her company whatsoever. And not only that, since Emma's sister, Isabella, is married to Mr. Knightley's brother and they have children, it is Emma's idea that Mr. Knightley should remain unmarried so that her nephew can inherit the Donwell Abbey estate after Mr. Knightley passes away. Because, Emma thinks that she is entitled to decide such things. But things are changing up in Highbury. We're around the middle of the story now. Frank Churchill's visit is over and he comes over to Emma's house to say goodbye. And when he's there, he seems out of sorts, like he wants to tell her something but stops himself. So they say farewell, goodbye, see you next time and all that. After his departure, Emma spends some time trying to figure out her feelings for Mr. Churchill. And her conclusion is that she is a little bit in love with him, but she will not be for very long. And she decides that if he were to propose to her, she would have to refuse him. Next plot point. As we know, the poor guy Mr. Elton, rejected so harshly by our dear Emma, went to Bath to escape the shame. Now it's time for him to return to Highbury, but lo and behold, he's not coming back alone. Not only does he seem to be over Emma's rejection, he is now married, and he's bringing his new Mrs. Elton home with him. This, as you can imagine, causes a lot of gossip amongst the good people of Highbury. Everyone wants to meet the new Mrs. Elton and, according to custom, pays them a visit at their house. There is a rather awkward scene here where Emma brings Harriet to visit Mr. and Mrs. Elton. I'd like to think of this decision as a display of Emma's sense of humour, as, of course, Mr. Elton finds this very uncomfortable. Having tea with his wife and the woman he wanted to marry and another woman he was expected to marry wasn't his idea of a pleasant afternoon. So we get to know Mrs. Elton here, and to nobody's surprise, Emma finds her absolutely horrid, while Harriet thinks she's absolutely lovely and thinks it's wonderful that Mr. Elton found himself such a nice wife. Poor Harriet. This girl breaks my heart. Emma's initial impression of Mrs. Elton was only to get worse. As the Eltons come over to visit Emma and her father, she gets to spend some alone time with Mrs. Elton. And goodness me, the woman is unpleasant. Despite having a mediocre background, Mrs. Elton talks as if she was the crème de la crème of society. Her sister had apparently married someone wealthy, and you can't count the number of times Mrs. Elton mentions her sister's estate and all their luxurious carriages, the barouche landau. She cannot talk enough about the barouche landau. She also has a habit of calling people by their surnames only, like Knightley instead of Mr. Knightley, and this made Emma quite upset as well. You know, the kind of person who loves to talk about themselves and their fortunes and connections, and yet they still make a very big deal about them being simple and humble people. That's Mrs. Elton. But more on that later. So Mrs. Elton is clearly bored with the country life of Highbury and decides to take on poor Jane Fairfax as her own little project. Jane is unfortunately very poor and thus has very low prospects of marrying well. So it is pretty much decided that Jane will take up a profession, in this case a governess. And Mrs. Elton naturally thinks of herself as Jane's best possible connection when it comes to finding a suitable position for her. Despite Emma not really liking Jane as a person, she can't help but feel for her and feel sorry for her for getting all of this attention from someone as unpleasant as Mrs. Elton. Then it's time for the next plot point. A ball is held at the local Crown Inn. and even Frank Churchill manages to make his way to Highbury for this. Everyone is having quite a merry time at this ball, and Emma is even dancing quite a lot with Frank. All of a sudden, Emma sees her friend Harriet sitting down all alone, being the only unmarried woman there who's not dancing. This is of course very bad indeed. So someone suggests to Mr. Elton that he should go up and dance, with a not so subtle hint at Harriet. Mr. Elton, however, went on about being an old married man now and had no inclination to dance, which was very rude of him, as he had only a moment before expressed how he would gladly dance with other ladies at the ball. Emma is beside herself with worry. Someone must save poor Harriet from this awful humiliation. So this is when Mr. Knightley stands up and invites Harriet to dance. A Mr. Knightley in shining armor, if you will. Later on during that evening, Emma expresses her gratitude to Mr. Knightley for saving her friend. She even went as far as admitting how wrong she had been for trying to be matchmaker between Harriet and Mr. Elton, as they were clearly not right for each other. The Knightleys' response to this is that Harriet would probably have been a better choice for him than the current Mrs. Elton. Mr. Knightley can be quite sassy when he wants to be. So the night goes on, and Emma dances with Mr. Knightley for the first time in her life, hinting that she might be seeing him in a new light. So the next plot point involves Harriet again. That girl is a magnet for misfortunes. One day she's taking a walk on a secluded road, and she runs into an encounter of a most horrid kind. Gypsy beggars. Yes, that is exactly what they are described as. So she's quickly overrun by the children of these gypsies who are begging for money. For some reason, Harriet is very panicked by this, and she tries to run away, but she slips and falls. It's not exactly clear whether the children was actually on top of her, trying to rob her, or if they just came too close for her personal comfort. Thankfully for Harriet, Frank Churchill happened to be walking nearby and saw the whole thing. He chases the gypsies off, thereby saving the day, and helps Harriet get to Emma's house safely. In seeing them arrive together, Emma starts wondering whether Harriet will fall in love with Frank Churchill now that he has saved her from this situation. And she finds herself supporting this hypothetical union because she has come to terms with the fact that she is no longer romantically interested in Frank Churchill herself. Emma finds that her suspicions are kind of confirmed when Harriet starts talking a bit cryptically about having someone that she was interested in, but she didn't really want to talk about it in detail because she considered him being far beyond her in social rank and so on. So to this, Emma gives her friend some kind advice, like more incredible things have happened and so on, which Harriet finds very comforting. We are in the middle of summer now, and Mr. Knightley invited a number of people to spend a day at his estate, Donwell Abbey. The group consists of pretty much every major character in the book: Emma and her father, Mr. and Mrs. Weston, Jane and her aunt, Miss Bates, Mr. and Mrs. Elton, and even Frank Churchill was invited, but he was delayed in getting there. So the party was split up into outdoors and indoors, and Emma decided to remain indoors with her father because he preferred that to the outside. Even during a heat wave, Mr. Woodhouse is afraid of catching a cold. Emma was quite happy to staying indoors because she hadn't been to Donwell Abbey in quite some time, and she really appreciated seeing it again. And this is where we get some peculiar encounters. When Emma is walking around, she runs into Jane Fairfax, who looks quite agitated. Jane asks Emma to let the others know that she's gone home, but only once they ask for her. Emma realizes that Mrs. Elton must have been getting on Jane's nerves about the whole governess thing, because she had been nagging her quite a lot about it. This made Emma look at Jane quite differently now that she's shown some real human emotion and personality. After Jane has left, Frank Churchill finally arrives. He decides to stay indoors with Emma and her father rather than going out to the grounds and finding the others. He was clearly very agitated, saying things like it was too hot for riding and so on. And Emma thinks herself very lucky not to be in love with him anymore because she could never put up with this temper. So the next outing for the gang, the distinguished neighbours of Highbury, is to a place called Box Hill. It's pretty much the same people that were at Mr Knightley's, with a few exceptions. So during this outing, Frank Churchill is not only on time, but is in a much better mood apparently. In fact, he is openly flirting with Emma, which both flatters her as well as makes her a bit uncomfortable. So she tries to steer him away from the conversation as everyone present is listening and the situation is a bit awkward. Without going into too much detail, she ends up making a joke about Jane's aunt, Miss Bates, about Miss Bates talking too much. Miss Bates is clearly hurt by this, but not much attention is drawn to it until it's time to leave Box Hill and go back to Highbury, and Mr Knightley stops Emma before her carriage. He calls her out for her joke, saying it was very cruel of her because Mrs Bates is very poor and so much below Emma in social standing, and he's really disappointed in her. Emma is basically shocked and ashamed, and she realizes that he's right. But in the shock of the moment, she just enters the carriage without a word, starts crying and feels very guilty. The next morning, Emma decides to pay Miss Bates a visit to apologize. She sets off very early, and when she arrives, she does so at a scene she wasn't really expecting. Jane Fairfax, who was also living there, had suddenly taken ill or something. It was quite dramatic, and she was unable to see Emma when she arrived and stayed in the bedroom. Miss Bates then informs Emma that Jane has just accepted a position as governess offered her by a friend of Mrs Elton's. It becomes clear to Emma that this must be why Jane is feeling very ill, or in modern language like anxious or stressed out, because she didn't really want to, but she was pushed into it. We're getting closer to the end now, so a lot of things are happening. The very next day, a letter arrives informing them that Frank Churchill's aunt had just passed away. Despite having never met her throughout the book, her presence was known through the complaints of others, especially of how she held Frank on a very tight leash and was very dramatic about her own health, or lack thereof. As the day of Jane's departure gets closer, she gets increasingly ill and refuses to see anyone. Emma feels very sympathetic towards Jane and feels that she might have judged her too harshly before. Ever since their short but revealing conversation at Mr Knightley's estate, she's beginning to see Jane in a new light, and she decides to try and help her. So she starts by sending over food, more specifically arrowroot, which Wikipedia told me could be used in cooking back then. But Jane sends the poor arrowroot back. So then Emma tries to get her outside for a carriage ride, thinking that this might cheer her up a bit. But alas, Emma takes her carriage all the way there in vain, as Jane doesn't want to see anyone. Then, by a very dramatic way, it is revealed to Emma, and thereby the reader, by a very distraught Mrs Weston, i.e. her former governess, that Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill have actually been secretly engaged for several months. Mrs Weston was terrified that this will break Emma's heart, but Emma no longer has any romantic feelings for Frank Churchill, so she's fine in that regard. But my poor Harriet. Emma is beside herself with worry for how her friend is going to take this news. She is also understandably angry at Frank Churchill for having been so flirtatious with her in front of Jane. Then it all becomes very clear that this must be why Jane no longer wants to see Emma or accept any food gifts from her. She must have been very uncertain about Mr Churchill's feelings for her, and therefore she accepted the position as governess, albeit reluctantly. Since Jane was so poor and Frank Churchill was the heir to his wealthy aunt, they had been unable to reveal their romantic connection Frank's aunt would never have agreed to them marrying. That was the sad reality of the time, unfortunately. But now, as she had passed away, Frank was free to reveal his love for Jane. So Emma invited Harriet over to tell her this grievous news. To her great surprise, however, it is Harriet that tells her about it as soon as she arrives, and even more surprisingly, she doesn't seem bothered by it at all. Emma is very confused. She tells Harriet that she was under the impression that she had feelings for Frank Churchill, to which Harriet merely laughs. She then reveals to her that her secret love had been Mr. Knightley. Emma is incredibly shocked and even quite disgusted at the idea. She actually spends minutes thinking this over as Harriet is still in the room. This qualifies as an awkward silence in my book. As we have heard many times over, Emma doesn't want Mr. Knightley to marry anyone because she wants her nephew to inherit his estate. But then it hits her. Mr. Knightley must marry none but herself. It was only when faced with the rivalry of her beautiful friend that Emma realized her love for Mr. Knightley and that he was the only man she could consider marrying. So Harriet leaves her to her thoughts, but Emma doesn't reveal her true feelings to her. She is very upset and she spends some time analyzing her feelings towards Knightley and this whole situation. She does some backtracking and realizes that Mr. Knightley could have feelings for Harriet based on how they had been interacting with each other. She even convinces herself that this might be true. Suddenly, about a day or so later, Emma runs into Mr. Knightley in her garden and they start walking together. There is awkwardness between them. She's very apprehensive about what he might say. What if he says something about Harriet? How would she take that? They do eventually speak, and Emma finds out that Mr. Knightley came to see how Emma had taken the news of Frank Churchill's and Jane Fairfax's engagement. Emma assures him that she had no such feelings for Frank, but she admits to having been tempted and enjoyed the attention she got from him. An honest and mature response, I would say. Knightley is very relieved to hear this because, as became more and more clear now, his feelings towards Emma. He starts to express these, although rather ambiguously, and it takes a while before Emma realizes that he's talking about her. And we get a beautiful moment of shared happiness as they both realize their love for one another. And then, in true Jane Austen fashion, they go inside to have tea with Mr. Woodhouse and his pharmacist friend, Mr. Perry. But everything is not yet resolved. What about Harriet? For the third time now, we're inclined to be worried about Harriet. And not only that, Emma was also struck with the horror of how she was going to tell her father. It had, after all, been because of him that she never wanted to marry in the first place. But before we get any resolution in that case, a letter arrived at Emma's from Mrs. Weston, also containing a forwarded letter from Mr. Churchill. In this very long letter, he explains himself as to his behavior during his visits to Highbury. He had been secretly engaged to Jane Fairfax, but been flirting a lot with Emma, indicating to everyone around them that there was more than friendship between them. He explains in this letter that he simply wanted to divert people's attentions away from Jane, and how Emma was a good choice because he felt that she was completely uninterested in him. He continues by saying that he almost confessed the truth to Emma that day when he was leaving Highbury after his first visit, but he had stopped himself because he felt some sort of suspicion from her, as if they already had an unspoken understanding. We also find out that it was, of course, him that had sent Jane the mysterious pianoforte. We are also treated to an account of basically every misunderstanding that occurred between him and Jane Fairfax, and explains in detail how they reconciled. The exact details aren't really important right now, as the mixed reactions they received. Emma was completely satisfied with his explanation and was prepared to forgive him for his behavior. She then let Mr. Knightley read the letter as well, being convinced that this will change his previously bad opinion of Mr. Churchill. What follows is a very interesting piece of dialogue between Emma and Mr Knightley, where they discuss the contents of Mr Churchill's letter. Mr Knightley makes a lot of comments as he's reading it, many of which quite negative, especially how Mr Churchill treated both Jane and Emma. And you can't really help but agree with him in some of these comments. He does, however, agree that Frank Churchill deserves a little bit of credit for his explanations. And Emma is pleased enough with this. And again, in a typical Jane Austen fashion, we are given a very formal discussion on how they can get married without causing too much grief on her father. This is the first time that they address this. After much consideration, Mr Knightley shows himself being very liberal by suggesting that he moves in with Emma and her father, rather than her having to leave her father. Another realization that Emma had, as she was thinking of her little nephew and how she had wished for him to be the heir of Donwell Abbey, how violently she had opposed the idea of Mr Knightley marrying for that very reason. She found great amusement in realizing how little she opposed it now, which I found was quite endearing. Then there is only one problem left, Harriet, as always. So Emma needs time to think about what to do here, and manages to get an invitation for Harriet to visit her sister in London, as you remember them being very fond of each other. So Harriet goes there for a few weeks, leaving Emma to enjoy Mr Knightley's company in peace, as she knew Harriet would have a lot of amusement in London to keep her occupied. During this time, Emma goes to visit Jane Fairfax. She is received with much kindness, but they aren't able to talk freely because Mrs Elton was there too. Mrs Elton is her usual self, and even makes it very clear that she knows a secret that they're not supposed to talk about. Emma realizes that she must know about the secret engagement, and is very proud to be let in on such a secret. When she leaves, however, Jane follows Emma outside, and they have a lovely heart-to-heart, and you can really sense how the friendship is growing in both women. Then it was time for the first dreaded conversation, to tell Mr Woodhouse about their engagement. Mr Woodhouse is a very peculiar man to begin with. He was very glad and comfortable by Emma's previous decision of remaining unmarried. So therefore he was very shocked and displeased. But eventually, as the plan of moving Mr Knightley to their house was relayed to him, he could bring himself to accept it at some point in the distant future. As for the rest of their friends and family, like Emma's sister, Mr and Mrs Weston, all of them were happy to hear the news, which continued to spread across Highbury. The only ones who weren't as happy about this match was, unsurprisingly, Mr and Mrs Elton. As we know from the beginning of the book, Mr Elton had proposed to Emma with quite the humiliating result. His reactions to her upcoming marriage was that of surly comments. His wife, though, had expressed the highest sympathies for poor Mr Knightley. She felt very sorry for him indeed. Then, finally, it was time for Harriet to return to Highbury. Emma had been dreading this moment. She had allowed herself a false sense of security in her absence. So a couple of days before Harriet's expected arrival, Mr Knightley drops by at Emma's house. He says he has some news, but that Emma won't like it, and it concerns Harriet Smith. Emma is of course very much intrigued by this and demands to hear it, upon which he tells her that Harriet is actually engaged, and to none other than Robert Martin, the very man that Emma had persuaded Harriet to refuse in the beginning of the book. Emma had of course been very shocked to hear this and demanded to hear how this all came to be. They had apparently met while she was in London, and he had been invited to dine with them there. And that was when their romance sort of rekindled, and he renewed his offer of marriage, which she immediately accepted. That was all the details that Mr Knightley could give her. And to quote him, "She will give you all the minute particulars which only woman's language can make interesting." again with the sassiness, Mr Knightley. After some reassurance, Emma admits to being perfectly happy for them and that she had no objection to their match anymore. She even says that she was a fool to have meddled in the first place, showing some real character growth. So we get to the final resolution. All the weddings. Harriet's took place first, and then it was time for Emma to try and set a date. This is where Emma's father was very difficult to persuade. He had agreed to them marrying at some point in the distant future. Not within a month or so. Emma almost lost her hope, but then something rather wonderful happened. A robbery occurred where Mrs Weston, as well as many others in the village, lost their turkeys. So naturally, Mr Woodhouse started fearing for his own poultry yard and thought that having a son-in-law living permanently with them might not be such a bad idea after all. So the wedding happened, everyone was happy, except for Mrs Elton, who thought the whole thing was very shabby, with not nearly enough white satin. That was my very long synopsis of Emma. Now we're moving on to discussing some character relationships from the book. My selection is based on the relationships I thought had the most impact on the story, so therefore I haven't included every single one. This is a long video as it is after all, so let's get into it. So this is a rather strange relationship. In today's standards, one would even call it overly attached or codependent. Mr Woodhouse is not a typical dad, to say the least. He is very content with the idea of having his youngest daughter stay unmarried and continue to live with him and keep him company through his old age. Which, in my view, feels like a very selfish thing to do. Emma had made this decision before the start of the book and had made her peace with it, sort of living in denial of her ever finding a true enough love that would compel her to leave her father. And Mr Woodhouse, I don't know his first name, so I'm just calling him Mr Woodhouse, he's just happy with this, never once expressing a wish for his daughter to, find a partner and eventually have a family of her own. Even at the point when she tells him that she wants to marry Mr Knightley, he gets upset. I mean, that's harsh. I know that I'm describing him like a very unlikable character, but despite this, he's actually one of my favorite characters in the book. It sounds contradicting, but that's the genius of Jane Austen. Mr Woodhouse is very concerned about health, mostly his own, but also the health of everyone in Highbury. He has these wonderful comments, like this one, after he had just heard that Jane Fairfax had gone to the post office on her own that morning. I am very sorry to hear, Miss Fairfax, of your being out this morning in the rain. Young ladies should take care of themselves. Young ladies are delicate plants. They should take care of their health and their complexion. My dear, did you change your stockings? There are a lot of comments like this in the book, and I just find them so endearing. I know that doesn't really have anything to do with his relationship with his daughter, but they say a lot about his character in general. Not to mention that his best friend in the world is the local pharmacist, Mr Perry. And he's constantly referencing his advice to people. My point is, despite this relationship being really codependent, the reader isn't really bothered by this because of Mr Woodhouse's endearing personality. Or at least I wasn't. But do let me know if you disagree. Emma befriends Harriet around the time when her governess leaves them to marry Mr Weston. It's quite clear that this is what made Emma get so attached to Harriet so quickly. She needed another BFF to spend her days with, and Harriet was the perfect candidate. She was sweet, gullible, and far below Emma in social rank. One can easily describe this relationship as somewhat toxic, at least in the beginning. Harriet admiring Emma and basically following her advice to the letter isn't a healthy situation for either of them. Not only should Harriet put more value in her own feelings regarding her life choices, but her apparent admiration for Emma only reinforces Emma's self-centered nature. Remember, Emma knows she's intelligent, and in the company of someone who doesn't challenge her ideas, her intelligence quickly turns to arrogance. With this background, it's easier to understand the misunderstanding about Mr. Elton. Had it not been for Emma's matchmaking between Mr. Elton and Harriet, she would have seen Mr. Elton's attentions towards her much sooner. She put all of her observational skill on them, thereby blinding herself for anything directed towards her. But of course, we wouldn't want it any other way, because then we wouldn't have the initial conflict of the story. But I find it interesting how well crafted this situation is. And again, how the toxic nature of this relationship can easily fly under the radar because of how likable Jane Austen's characters are. I really can't help but love Harriet. She's so sweet and naive, but not in an annoying way. In the end, Harriet is the person I was most happy about to have found love, because she finally accepted the validity of her own feelings, despite what anyone else might think. Her arc is a bit more behind the scenes, but it's no less fulfilling in my opinion. Seeing as this is the main romance of the story, it should be fairly straightforward, but it's not really. It's actually kind of disturbing. Mr. Knightley is 37 or 38 at the start of the book, and Emma is 21. The age difference is significant according to today's standards, but not at all unusual for the time period, so we can't judge this too harshly. The thing I find disturbing, however, is the fact that Mr. Knightley kind of helped raise Emma. Or at least he was a presence at her home through her entire upbringing, basically, due to their family connections and his friendship with her father. Knightley saw early on what an intelligent child Emma was, and kind of made it his mission to guide her and make sure she didn't turn out an arrogant snob. Simply put, she was his personal project. On several occasions in the book, Knightley lectures her whenever he feels like she's in the wrong. And he does so in an affectionate way, but he does sound a bit like a parent scolding a child. When we get to the end of the book, he admits that he has been in love with her since she was 13. 13. At that time, he was about 30 years old himself. Again, times were different back then, obviously, but still, I can't not mention it. Pushing all of the disturbing stuff aside, we do see a true connection between Emma and Knightley as individuals. Just reading their conversations is very satisfying from an intellectual standpoint. They are clearly each other's equals in this regard. There is something really effortless about it. It's like I feel like a fly on the wall whenever these two are speaking. The way that they address each other feels very natural, as if they have indeed been friends for many years. This is also something that Jane Austen does very well, and any author or writer today should try and learn from. Throughout the book, Emma can be described as being quite narrow-minded in her worldview, again only emphasized by her friendship with Harriet. And Knightley is the only one who calls her out for it, like telling her straight on that she was wrong in matchmaking Harriet and Mr. Elton. And he was extremely disappointed in her when he learned that it was through Emma's influence that Harriet had refused Mr. Martin the first time. Emma is quite upset by the disagreement, but she's unrelenting in her view that she is right and he is wrong. It's only through the various events throughout the story that this begins to change. And as this happens, Emma also starts seeing Mr. Knightley in a different way. Most notably because of his kindness to Harriet at the Crown Inn ball when she had been slighted by Mr. Elton. This is also the first time that Emma and Knightley dance together, and she realizes what a good dancer he is. As in many other Jane Austen novels, a situation like that is sure to spark a bit of romance. But Emma doesn't actively think of him in a romantic way until Harriet reveals having feelings for him. From Knightley's perspective, he always knew he loved Emma, and the flirting between her and Frank Churchill caused him great jealousy. Several times through the book does he talk about him in a negative way, which Emma disagrees with, but as a reader you can actually see kind of what he means by this, especially once it's been revealed that Churchill and Jane Fairfax was secretly engaged. In the end, Emma realized how conceited she had been and made an effort to change. This was, in large part, thanks to Knightley calling her out for her mistakes, but also because of her own insights. Something that I liked was, whenever Emma admitted to having been wrong about something, Knightley would also admit to being wrong about something himself, meeting her halfway, as we say. This is a very human reaction, as we tend to sympathize whenever someone admits to being wrong. This is just one of the many things that make Jane Austen's characters so relatable, and in the case of Emma and Knightley as well. Because despite there being a couple of 100 years between us today and this fictional couple, we can still find things about it that we can relate to. The relationship between Emma and Jane was initially formed by misunderstandings, and it shows us how wrong we can be about a person if we get to know them under less than ideal circumstances. Throughout the book, Emma thinks of Jane as being cold and reserved. But when we think about it, Jane had a very difficult time throughout pretty much the whole story. She had entered a secret engagement with a wealthy man whom she was in love with, Frank Churchill, but was of course afraid that she had made a mistake in doing this, in giving her love to him without the security of an official attachment. On top of this, she had to watch while Frank was being openly flirty with Emma, and she couldn't say or do anything about it. So for Jane to have appeared reserved under those circumstances is pretty normal, and this is how Emma ended up seeing her. And, she also had to endure the special attentions of Mrs. Elton, but more on that later. Jane had very good reasons for being jealous of Emma. Not only did Emma have wealth and thereby also security, she was also given attention from the man that Jane loved. While Jane, on the other hand, might be forced to take a position as a governess in order to make ends meet and help her family financially. This wasn't exactly solid ground to build a friendship on, and as time went by, Jane's jealousy towards Emma only increased, eventually leading to her actually leaving the room when Emma came to visit. Even though Jane tried to keep her feelings in check, there is only so much one person can take. So when they were at Donwell Abbey, Mr Knightley's estate, she was being nagged by Mrs. Elton one too many times about finding a governess position that she simply couldn't take it anymore and decided to leave by sneaking off. And that was when she ran into Emma, who was surprised by seeing her so agitated. And surprisingly, that was exactly what was needed. She really appreciated that Jane had shown some real human emotion. And from that moment on, Emma began seeing her differently. Eventually, after all the secrets were out, Emma goes to congratulate Jane on her engagement. And this is where they have a candid conversation for the first time, and it becomes clear to the reader that a strong friendship is building between these two women. I couldn't not bring up Mrs. Elton. She is the closest thing we get to an antagonist in this story, and she's highly unpleasant. And I love every single scene with her. She's one of those characters you really love to hate. Despite being fairly middle class herself, she's constantly name-dropping her wealthier connections. She's always judging other people based on how luxurious lifestyle they have. And to top it all up, she never misses on an opportunity to call herself humble. It's just brilliant. Mrs. Elton is a caricature, but still, I think everyone has known, or will at some point know a Mrs. Elton at some point in their lives. It's just that kind of timeless and unfortunate personality trait. This makes her a very important addition to the story, because in all the frustration she causes, there is intrigue. Let's start with Emma. She did not hold back in her first impressions, even going as far as calling her an insufferable woman, a little upstart, and a vulgar being, all in the same paragraph. Although, in true Jane Austen fashion, this wasn't spoken out loud. Mrs. Elton wanted to form an attachment with Emma early on, because of course she would want to make herself a popular new addition to the society of Highbury. Emma, however, had no such plans, and made sure only to spend as much time with Mrs. Elton as was considered appropriate and polite. Seeing as Emma was of higher social rank, she could do this without too much fuss. Poor little Jane Fairfax, however, had no such luck. So when Mrs. Elton decided to make Jane her little pet, she had no other option but to graciously accept and even be grateful for the attention she got from her. When you think about it, it makes perfect sense that Mrs. Elton would want to befriend Jane, since Jane was poor and seemingly without any prospects of marrying well. A person like Mrs. Elton needs to assert their own status by constantly highlighting the inferiority of someone else. In this case, Jane Fairfax. For example, Mrs. Elton could lend her their carriage, which would generally be considered a kind and generous gesture. But Mrs. Elton never does anything if she can't boast about it. And so it continues with her helping poor Jane in everything that she possibly can, and letting everyone around them know what an angel she is for doing it. So, goodness me, this was a very long video. I even had to take a break after the synopsis to give Niles here a little walk and charge the battery in the camera. I've never spent this long filming ever. So if you're still here, thank you so much for watching. Please remember to give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Drop me a comment if you have any thoughts. And yeah, thank you again, and I hope to see you back next week. Bye! Oh, that's cold.